This is the LOC2 release format. It uses every card up until LOC2 and uses the 2022 September 1st ban list. It's the most diverse format we've had, and one of the best of all time. In this video, I'll briefly talk about the meta and give my opinions on the meta, including some changes. But first, I'll briefly run over each of the big 8 decks in order of best to worst. This is APC, which stands for a perfect circle. The deck doesn't really have a proper name since it's just a bunch of cards chucked together, but it's a control deck, and there's a control deck called Perfect Circle in Yu-Gi-Oh! And a decent player called Goldfish Gallant knows a band called A Perfect Circle, so it's just called that. The deck doesn't really have a coherent strategy, but it's got some really good individual cards. You can swap out Shiozin Lava Behemoth for Avalanche Overlord, Burning Damocloid for KO, and that's about it. Because your main deck has good Guardian outs and permanent resource removal, you have more flexibility in the sideboard and can play cards like Super Bouncy Trampoline or Monument to Creation. It has good matchups into Polysium Midrange, Sindel Tempo, and loses to Gaia's Mind Control, and every other matchup is close. However, you can easily make some adjustments to pick what matchups are favoured. This is solo aggro. The deck aims to use Guardians early to help apply pressure, with strong boards, and uses Dog and Sama to get your zone set up fast. It then uses a few bursts with Solomon Sam Blaze in pair with Time Flash Portal and Overlord for removal to win the game. You can swap out a TFP for Abandonment. Avalanche Overlord is in question at 2, and a card like Dropless Quaz could be played instead. Some other options to be played is Helper Belt, another Abomination Tomb, Behemoth, or KO. Your biggest issue in the mirror is the inability to kill early Guardians, so sideboarding Behemoth or KO could help with that. You also don't have any permanent resource removal, so Crow Comet or Calamars could be sided. Solo aggro has good matchups into Xemius and Sindel Tempo, and everything else is close. However, you can create a few more favourable matchups with an effective sideboard. This is Polysium Midrange. It plays only big creatures and ways to get them out cheaply, to build up pressure over the opponent, and then uses TFP to get in for points. Some other options are TFP to Abandonment, and Erratic Void and Sordreys are other good options. This deck has solid coverage in the main deck, so it's pretty flexible in what it can sideboard. It has bad matchups into APC and Gaia's MC, and everything else is pretty close. This is Sindel Tempo. It tries to win the game by creating an early board presence to overwhelm the opponent, and closing out games with Time Flash Portal. You can swap out Shiozin Lava Behemoth for an Avalanche Overlord or Suburban of Sindel. Sword can be swapped out for Skellypede. KO can be swapped out for another form of removal, and Relhex Mind can be swapped out for a value creature such as FaceTime, Gusta, Fraxel, or Dropless Quaz, or even a Helper Belt. The deck doesn't main deck any permanent resource removal, so you may want to side a Crow Rock Comet or Calamars. It has good matchups into Gaia's MC, bad matchups into Xemius, Solo Aggro, Crozon, and APC. Every other matchup is close to 50-50. However, you can easily make some adjustments, as shown before, to make any matchup good. However, you won't be able to tech for everything. This is Gaia's Mind Control. The deck has 2 attachments that make the opponent's creatures Gaia's, and then either kill them with Flooper or steal them with Lighthouse. This creates a lot of open boards to get in for damage. There aren't any direct swaps, but cards like Shiozin Lava Behemoth, Shiozin Lava Mole, Dropless Quaz, and Time Flash Portal can all be played. This deck doesn't have any permanent resource removal, so it can side Crow Rock Comet or Calamars. It has good matchups into Crozon, Polysium Midrange, Gaia's Midrange, and Xemius, and a bad matchup into Sindel Tempo. This is Xemius. There's lots of ways to play the deck, but none of them have stuck out yet. All variants, however, try to set up 8 killed creatures from different planets to loop Xemius each turn. Some other options is a quicker variant with Talakon, Quadruple C, Quill, Batterer, Galaxy Rock, the Mini Ozos, Fraxel, Kaleidoscope Warriors, Universe Boundary, Abomination Tomb, and nearly everything in the deck is cuttable besides Xemius. This deck doesn't have any permanent resource removal, so it could side a Crow Rock Comet or Calamars. The deck's also vulnerable to Abandonment, so cards like Burning Damocloid and Black Hole Blocker could be considered. It has a good matchup into Sindel Tempo and a bad matchup into APC, Solo Aggro, and everything else is pretty close. This is Crozon midrange. There's also a variant that runs no activators and focuses more on Crozon and early board presence. Both variants aim to set up Crozon early and then use its effect to set up back-to-back big creature boards. Some other options to play are Pelfam for Cell Sign, Pajiru, or another Cranchon Blur or Mystical Beast of the Deep. This deck needs to maintain a high count of Belissian creatures, so it needs to keep that in mind when sideboarding. It has a good matchup into Sindel Tempo and a bad matchup into APC and Gaios MC. This is Gaios midrange. It has a few variants that either do or don't play the Cistian and Flooper packages. The deck uses Cistian to set up Root early whilst going +1, and uses Super Flooper, Gla, and Traps for damage. However, it struggles with stats in the early game. You can swap out the Flooper package for cards like Behemoth, Time Flash Portal, and Gargantros, and the Cistian package can be replaced by Ficadorus, another Vokapeki mech, and maybe even a Shiosian Lava Maul. For sideboarding, this deck doesn't main deck any permanent resource removal, so it may want to play an Underwood Burrower, Kalamask, or Coral Rock Comet. It also gets extremely countered by opponent's Super Flipper, so Super Bouncy Trampoline may be needed. It doesn't have any good matchups, however it does lose badly to Gaios MC. There's also a few other decks like Roka midrange, Tekla midrange, Shios midrange, Gaios aggro, Ozos, and Omni's control, which are all just a few cards off being competitive strategies. Here's a list of sideboard cards against each deck, with the most popular ones being Super Flooper, Abandonment, Shockwave 8, and some form of Scardian removal. It's also important to note that due to the ability to sideboard for most matchups, decks will fluctuate. For example, if people start playing Abandonment instead of TFP, APC and Solo Aggro may no longer be the best two decks, but Pally might be instead. Now let's talk a bit about where each planet is at. I'll put Shios in C tier since it has no competitive deck, but it has the tools that make it very close to success. I believe it has the best planet effect and has a wide range of support cards. The issue is, it has too many mini strategies rather than focusing on one coherent strategy. As it stands, the planet has some hand control cards, some Crimson Grenade strategies with high power and low attack, some board focus strategies, and now it's got a high creature count strategy with Mouth Mouth. It can build into each of these strategies, but none is really a competitive deck. I'd love to see the board presence mid-range variant see support, because as it stands, the support cards like Scoria Carrier and Firewall are the win conditions, when they should be support cards to a bigger win condition. I'll put Barrow in C tier with Shios, since its only competitive deck doesn't even focus on the planet effect, but it has the base to make a planet-focused strategy. It also has one of the best archetypes in the game, which is the Burrow Bugs. The issue with the planet is just a lack of good cards. As it stands, the planet has a few Burrow Bug cards and a few good generic planet cards. I'd love to see the planet get 2 more creatures that support the Burrow Bugs and help to allow Barrow to create 2 creature boards easier. This would encourage its support cards like Desert Quake and Humongous Creation to be played, and would hopefully create a coherent strategy revolved around the bugs. I'll put Sindel in A tier, since it has a deck strongly focused around the planet in Sindel Tempo. It has some great support cards that focus around one coherent theme, which is self-mill and recursion. The planet also has some other strategies such as a control strategy using Gehenna or the Gatomics. However, these strategies are much further behind and would require further support. Now, just because it has a viable planet-based strategy doesn't mean the planet shouldn't receive buffs. Currently the deck's biggest weakness is having to deal with creatures with more than 400 health, so it compensates with non-Sindel cards to deal with them. It would be nice to have one card that helps deal with bigger creatures and competes with Scalarghast as a bone ladder target. I'll put Cindy in F tier. It sounds harsh, but it really does deserve it. As it stands, its only reason to play the planet is so that your cards don't die to abandonment. There is just no reason to play it since you can never use its effect. It has some great individual cards, but you just can't play them in Cindian yet. The planet needs a group of cards that give the planet a reason to be played. To do this, you would need small creatures worth protecting, and some cards that can manipulate the board to make these creatures easier to protect. I'll put Tekla in C tier, as it has a playable deck based around the planet, but not a competitive one. It also has a combiner deck, but you only play Tekla with this to avoid abandonment, since they have no synergy with the planet's effect. The planet has some great support cards, and there's not really one area it goes wrong in, but there's not one area it goes right in. It needs a card to help with economy, a card to help with board presence, a card to help with consistency, and another win condition, or more Talakon support. I'll put Gaius in B tier, since it has 3 competitive strategies. However, one of them doesn't really count since it only uses the planet for Thungerwalk and Gla. However, once you sideboard for the other 2 decks, they become very beatable. The planet has a wide range of options, some really strong small creatures, some strong non-creature support, but the planet lacks some stats. It plays Truant and sometimes Gargantuous just for its stats with Temple Traps, and its next biggest card is probably North. The major issue, however, is Super Flooper. If the opponent sideboards this in, it makes them favored no matter the matchup. The planet definitely needs an inbuilt way to deal with Super Floopers that is also playable against other strategies. Ideally, it also gets a creature that has some stats behind it. I'll put Roka in B tier, purely because of the Scardians. It has one competitive deck which plays the Scardians for early threats. However, the deck is really just a rainbow deck. It also has a playable strategy focused on Car, and cards in the opponent's hand. The planet has some great individual cards, however it's lacking a bit of stats and a way to get 2 creature boards. The planet could really do with a cheaper 1 or 2-star creature to help get some board presence, and I'd love to see it play into the messing with the opponent's card theme it has going. It feels like it shouldn't be here, but I'm going to put Polyseum in A tier. It has 2 competitive strategies, but other than that it doesn't really have anything. The planet feels weird to put into A tier since it doesn't have much depth. The planet plays Cranchon, Mantilossus, and Cabostrus, which are all essentially vanillas. However, due to higher ceiling cards like Serpent, Jetpack, Crozen, and Crown, the decks are able to thrive. However, the planet could still do with a buff. The mid-range variant only uses the planet's effect on duple drop, so it would be interesting if it had another way to utilize it more. And overall, the planet could do with another interesting boss monster, maybe 7 stars to avoid Shockwave 8. If we briefly look at the state of the format, you'd probably call it an aggro format, since most of the mid-range decks are aggro slanted, which isn't my personal favorite, but it's fine to mix it up. The format, however, is really missing a control strategy. It has APC, which is more of a mid-range deck with control tools, rather than a control deck. I think there's a real opportunity for Syndion to get a control deck with his next planetary collection. There's also a few non-planet related decks I briefly want to touch on. Soulstream has really kickstarted the viability of rainbow decks, and decks like Omnius and Ozo are a few cards off being competitive strategies. In particular, I'd like to see Ozo be back as a competitive deck. The deck mainly just needs a bit of consistency and board presence in those turns you don't have Ozo. If you look at all the decks shown, combiners aren't played at all. Now, combiners are playable, but their decks aren't competitive. You can play Sindel Control with Gehenna, Kazarak Spam, or a few Army of Justice decks. In my eyes, combiners either have 2 roles in decks. They're spammed over and over, which is fine to have as a playable deck like Kazarak's, but it should probably never be a competitively viable deck, due to the nature of the deck being boring and skillless to play against. To do this, you need consistency cards like Telepathic Touch, and the right loop cards like Combine Harvester, so this spam strategy is in a pretty good state and doesn't really need to be touched. The other role combiners play is to just fit into a normal deck more like a 2-card combo that isn't looped over and over. To do this you need strong combiners, which we only have Gehenna and Army of Justice currently. You also need cards that synergize with both creatures and combiners, which currently we don't have. For example, if cards like the Magical Zemelian Tree could search Gaius combiners, if Yungalian could search Syndion combiners, this would go a long way to making it easier to fit combiners into a normal deck without building your whole game plan around them. In terms of skill of the format, it's pretty good. Definitely one of the highest skill formats, but not as skillful as Sindel Days. This is largely due to the meta being more diverse, which makes it a bit more like rock, paper, scissors, because sometimes you just run into matchups where it feels like there's nothing you can do to make it even. There's also just a low floor to some decks. Like with Zemius, you just play cards until Zemius is set up, and then you spam that until the opponent can't kill it. With Solo Aggro, you can just place Guardians turn 2 and hope the opponent doesn't have an out, then accidentally draw your 13-point burst combos. With Polysium decks, you can just spam a bunch of big creatures. Like some games, you just get a bit unlucky and there's zero counterplay, as the opponent just spams cards or relies on one really broken card. In terms of the way Zach has designed recently, it's been really good. The Planetary Collections and Set 5 have produced the cores to nearly every current competitive deck. The only critique I have is the direction he's designing cards feels a bit too spammy, with Abomination Tomb and Soulshroom coming to mind. But other than that, there's been some really cool and unique card designs. In terms of the ban list, I don't mind too much since the format is fine in its current state. However, if I were to make changes, it'd be to ban Turret and limit Super Flipper. Turret essentially takes up 2 deck slots since it forces Activation Activated to be played, so if you ban Turret you get rid of 2 unskillful cards and free up 2 deck slots. Now Super Flipper is weird because limiting it buffs Skyos. This is because if the opponent sideboards it in against Skyos, it can basically never win. It's free removal and an extremely big body. In the future, I'd like to see it unlimited if Gaius has some counterplay against it, but for now, Gaius can never be competitive whilst sideboards exist. And it's not like you can just get rid of sideboards because then the game becomes rock, paper, scissors. Over the course of the format, we also collected some data from tournaments and ELO games. Now, the sample size is small, and you also have to understand that some people just play casual decks. So, a deck may have a 70% win rate, which is usually unhealthy, but it has a 50% win rate against competitive decks, which is healthy. Overall, you notice the Big 8 decks are the best decks, with the main outlier being Crows and midrange. This is just mainly due to it not being played by any of the top 5 players in tournaments, but it's still a good deck. In terms of card usage, nothing really pops out besides Darkspark and Beast of the Conjurers, which are 2 very good generic 6 stars that set up your board. You notice AAAs in 94% of decks, but that's more because the attack negates are super strong, rather than the card itself being broken. There's also a card win rate section, but that's basically just deck win rate. Now, I don't want people to get this misconception that I want every card to see competitive play. I think what players want, and myself, are cards that function in a galaxy and help support its planet or archetype without being a detriment to a player's own strategy. And Zach did a really good job with this in Set 5, where there are cards that are not competitively playable, but still feel like they add to a strategy. Cards like Tribite and Inari pop to mind, rather than cards that are actively making your position worse, like Mush and Galaxy Rave. To summarize, there's 8 viable decks that can all beat each other depending on your sideboard, besides Skyos, which auto loses to Super Flipper. Every planet could do with some buffs to make planet-themed decks more popular than rainbow-themed decks. I'd also like to see the return of Ozo, as well as control strategy, and the viability of combiners. The ban list is fine, but I'd like to see Turret banned and Super Flip limited. Other than that, Zach's done a great job designing Set 5 and the Planetary Collections. The link to my fan-made cards and the data are in the description. Don't take them too seriously, they're just for fun. Anyways, the LOC2 format is super cool, the LOC2 arts are great, and I'll see if I can get them on Untap. Peace.